You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian ghetto. Welcome to another episode of the Christian Ghetto podcast. It's my pleasure today to have John Slaughter Esquire join me to talk about something that doesn't necessarily seem on the surface perhaps to be a specifically Christian political topic, but one that I think is important for our time, and one it was interesting to hear John's thoughts of it, in our group chat, and to realize that his thoughts are very similar to mine. And he has experience as a Marine, and so comes from it from that perspective. I've always hesitated to talk about this idea of the difference between the warrior and the soldier, because I haven't done military service. And so there's generally that thing, well, if you haven't done military service, you can't talk about these sort of things, which is generally kind of nonsense anyway. So John suggested to me that maybe we get together and we have a chat about this, and we talk through some of this, not just the difference between, the warrior and the soldier, but then also some of how violence and the soldier figure, the warrior figure, are framed and understood in a Christian experience over the longer stretch of Christian history that way. And some of the aspects of it, just because I think these days there's a strong sort of pacifist pushback against Christians being involved in politics and other aspects of political life, in a sense, because of the violence that's often associated with politics and the state formation and so forth. So with that bit of introduction, welcome, John. It's a pleasure to have you join me today.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to get into this discussion. It's been one that I think has been pretty fruitful so far. So
yeah, and as we talked about getting on before air, I thought maybe the way to begin to approach this is, rather than trying to answer the question, first of all, what is the difference between a soldier and a warrior, and why is it that it's important for many guys who are soldiers to think of themselves as warriors? And we'll probably get into some of that. But to begin with the question, more or less, of maybe in some ways, like, what is a warrior? And then, but more importantly, what is it that separates a warrior from, some thug with weapons? Just some guy who's good at fighting, maybe hand-to-hand fighting, maybe with, projectile weapons, bow, arrow, guns, that kind of thing. What is it that separates a warrior from just some tough guy with weapons?
well, I think first there is a clear distinction. There's really three levels, right? You have a warrior, you have soldiers, and then you could say you have thugs. And within that frame of soldiers, you could even include, soldiers of fortune, mercenaries, etc. But the big difference, what separates a warrior from all of those, is that if you look at traditional societies, being a war fighter or being, martially competent, we'll say, it's not the only aspect of the warrior. The warrior sits atop of the social hierarchy. He's a member of the aristocracy, and he always, across cultures, exemplifies the values of honor, bravery, spiritual discipline. He's a defender of the culture itself in some aspect, and he's held to a higher standard. The probably, like, the example par excellence would be like the chivalric code, right? This wasn't something that, we often have this misconception when we think, or people will think of medieval warfare, and they think the battlefield filled with knights. Well, there are knights on the battlefield, but there are footmen, there are infantrymen around him. There's a distinction even then. Same thing with, if you go back to the Greeks, there's a distinction between the war, like the Spartans fight next to helots, right? So they're even distinguished. So I think the defining characteristic of the warrior is that position in the social hierarchy, his commitment to a spiritual and cultural defense, essentially. And he also fights by a code, which is something that obviously the thug, somebody who's just competent and good at combat doesn't do. And it's also something the soldier doesn't do, because the soldier, even if he's patriotic, at the end of the day, most of the time fights for financial gain of some sort. He's paid, he's part of a trained military unit. it's not his life, because again, because of the position the warrior holds in society or historically has, that's all he is for his entire life. It never ends. The warrior, he starts at at a young age, and when he dies, he's still a warrior. He doesn't retire and go off and do something else. So I think like I said, the real line, sort of a demarcation, is that position in the social hierarchy and the higher ideals that he embodies that aren't just combat.
Yeah, and I think, as we were talking beforehand too, it also, that dovetails into the place of the warrior in the development of the unfolding of a culture. In that, and this is the Spenglerian analysis, is that what Spengler calls the Valhallan stage before a culture emerges, is that it is really the warriors who take whatever it is that's there, this substance of something that's like latent within a group of people, and it is the warriors that then take it upon themselves and give it life and give it structure, give it form. And by giving it form, they then ascend to the preeminent position in this group of people through their initiate. It's almost the warriors who initiate the culture itself, and they become its first repository. It's at the first place where it grows and expresses itself.
It's interesting because it kind of it goes fairly well with Evola's conception of where the warrior emerges from, because it's for Evola, he looks at traditional societies as whether it's the king, whatever the top of their hierarchy is, whatever the label is, it doesn't matter. He's usually the divine on earth, right? He's some representation of of God, or their pantheon of gods on earth, or he's a descendant of that. And the warriors emerge as those people that protect him, and therefore their proximity to this manifestation of God on earth makes them, or gives them, this connection to the spiritual realm that is intrinsic to being a warrior. And so that's how he sees the warrior emerging, as this connection to the metaphysical, because all these ancient cultures would have said, okay, whoever it is, the pharaoh, whoever, is actually the descendant of God, or he's his representation on earth. So there's this connection to the spiritual that emerges from the warrior caste in the beginning, at least from Evola's perspective. And I think there's something similar in that with what Spengler is getting at.
Yeah, because Spengler goes into a lengthy discussion about the nature of race and culture, race and language. And so Spengler argues that race primarily is not a thing of genetics, although there's a component to it, and it's not a thing of language and culture, but it's primarily, race is a thing of place. So it's a people who are tied together and shaped by a particular place, he says, for about 20 generations. So you're looking at, depending how fast the generations unfold, probably about 200 to 400 years, but probably closer to about 400 years locked into a particular place. And it is this place then that shapes the people and binds them together. So there's this process of, ethnogenesis that way, that the place shapes it. And so what happens is that there's a spiritual connection that develops between the people and the land, and partly it is shared language or so forth. And so there's in this sort of fallow period where there's this, it's not really a culture yet. It's just sort of this indistinct group of people who are bonding together. And it is out of this bonding together that the warrior class emerges. And so he talks about the warrior class in a sense of being very, very concerned with manners, custom, and good speech, like sort of talk. So there's a sense of the what makes the warrior is this formality of life that they bind themselves to. So there's a sense of customs, of rules, like you say, the code. But like the idea of a code, I think is a later thing that we impose back to kind of understand it. But he says, out of this countryside, this land, then the nobility, this warrior nobility, emerges as the repository of whatever it is that is binding this people together in this particular place. And so they become the singular examples, or the preeminent examples of what we as a people are.
Right. And so I guess that's where you see like the chivalric ideal, right? Because we all know that the knights as a whole do not live up to that standard, right? But that standard exists regardless, because they're sort of, I guess, like the platonic form of the ideal hero for that culture, right? And I think knights are the easiest example because it's the closest to us and has a cultural tie of some sort. But I think also when you talk about formalizing and having this code, I think one of the key aspects, and one of the reasons we don't see the warrior today, is because there's an intimacy in violence that exists. You can kind of experience it in combat sports or in any hand-to-hand combat that doesn't exist in modern combat. The distance in between combatants basically gets rid of the rule code. But that code, that formalization of a code of how you fight and what is considered honorable, is very tangible and real when you're face to face with an individual and you're actually having to essentially kill another human being, and you actually have to do it and you have to see that occur. And I think from that, because of that, there's that formalization because of the intimacy in that, and you have a respect. And a lot of people will think it's a glorification of violence, and in some cases it can be. We can look at warrior cultures that, from our standards, would be glorifying violence. We look at a lot of the Native American tribes, the Apache, the Comanche. We would think extremely barbaric, but from their cultural standpoint, they're adhering to this standard that they think is normal and okay. And I think that formalization process is lost. That code is lost once, and this is something Junger talks about in World War I, and the experience of seeing these giant machines roll in and just decimate the land. And also, you no longer spend your entire life training for this process, right? If you think about how early on a knight, when he's a squire, goes through this process, becomes a knight, and that's his life. You now just can take a man, any fairly competent man, and give him a gun and put him on, as long as he can follow orders, he can execute, tactical plans. He can do all that. But that code, that honor code, does not exist anymore. So I guess you could say we have different formalized codes with, rules of war, but those are sort of arbitrary and they're drawn by whoever wins.
Yeah. And they serve a different purpose in that regard. And this is, I think, why the year sort of the 1000, and as you mentioned, like the chivalric codes, because they all kind of emerge at the same time. So if you think of that 400-year formation period in, like, for the West in Northern Europe, between France and Germany and so forth, that, the Roman Empire falls apart in 400s, but a lot of it kind of continues on. And the quote unquote Middle Ages lasts from about 600 to the year 1000, which is when Spengler talks about this new warrior elite emerging. But it emerges into a society in which also Christianity has largely come to dominate the European continent during that 400-year period. So that's when you have the Christianization of Europe. And in this process, then, what pops out from this, what you might say, this indistinct Valhallan people tied to this land in Northern Europe across these various, is that this thing that becomes the West is what emerges then is this warrior elite. And so I've always understood it as what happens is that the violent Germanic spirit that's there becomes constrained by the Christian faith and is altered and shifted by it in a sense that there's a kind of a dual motive. So violence is still present in society, and because of human beings are sinful, they just recognize that there's a certain level of violence in society. But the violence in society during the Middle Ages becomes contained within a Christian framework. And so you have the hierarchy of being in which people are trying to ascend the ladder, so to speak, for union with God. And so the priest on the one hand does it in one way, but the warrior does it in a different way. And the Christian faith then constrains this violence, gives it its set of rules, gives it its context, but then also through the hierarchy of being also gives it a spiritual path in which the goal of the warrior is not necessarily to go out and kill other people and dominate them, but part of the goal in the Western warrior, at least anyways, is the mastery of himself and the union of God by becoming, in a sense, by embracing the warrior code that exists within this Christian context. And in so becoming the good warrior, so to speak, that you then ascend the ladder towards union with God. And that's sort of the warrior's path, is this self-mastery that allows him to ascend and to finally gain union with God. But his particular task, the role that he's given by God, is his wielding of violence in society to both protect the people and then to do justice and to maintain order, if that makes sense.
No, it does, especially if you consider the fact that if you look at specific, like the Knights Templar, for example, and you look at the way they live their lives, like a lot of people don't know that especially early on, and obviously the institution becomes corrupted, but in the beginning, you couldn't be married. You were a monk. You were a warrior monk. That's what you were. You couldn't be married. You didn't have possessions outside of, the stuff that a knight would normally have. A lot of them, if you read the personal accounts, many of them would go out of their way to fast continuously. They would purposely sleep on the ground. They would live the life of a monk, right? This very ascetic life, this very dedicated life. They go to mass every day. They would pray. But that same spiritual discipline is something that manifests itself martially as well, right? And I think that's another key component of what the warrior is he is spiritual, right? And I think people often overlook that because our society wants to divorce violence completely as being something that is, it is a negative, but it's an essential part of the fallen nature of humanity. You can't avoid it, right? Mm-hmm. It never occurred to any of the medieval knights that it was wrong for them to go on crusade. That wasn't, especially in the first crusade, right? That would never have occurred to them at all. And because of that, that was it was completely normal for the idea that you could have these warrior monks, which is essentially, whether you're looking at the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights Templar, the Order of St. John, all these different, because there's more than, one martial order. That was something that was seen as necessary, for one. And as you said, it was a way for the church and for Christianity to constrain that warrior impulse that largely does come from the Germanics, right? And part of that too, I think, is when the Germanic tribes are introduced to Christianity, you can't come in and tell them, oh, well, there's no violence period whatsoever. The world doesn't work that way. And at no point in time did it occur to them to think that, and they would have rejected it out of hand. And I think you see this with one of my favorite stories about this and I believe it's King Clovis, and I could be wrong on this. when he's first converted and he's told the story of the crucifixion. And he says, oh, if me and my men were there that day, we would have avenged. I believe he said something to the effect that we would have avenged, or he would have never been crucified, right? Because that's their mentality on it. That's the way they
exactly.
see the world, But as you said, I think what Christianity does is it allowed for that violence that is necessary, because you have to have people to defend the culture and defend the people. But it put moral constraints on it that were completely with Christianity. They weren't anathema to it in any capacity whatsoever.
Yeah, and this then sort of gets us, as you move then forward in Western history, because this is our context, as you begin to move out of that late medieval period, which is really the beginning of Western culture, that as you move into through the Reformation into the Enlightenment, and as word begins to take a bigger stake. So that was the other thing that Spencer mentions, is that the role of the priestly class is that they take the culture, because culture, in a sense, the songs, the stories, all exist within the warrior class. They're an elite sort. So all these things like the Song of Roland and the Ring of the Nibelung, the Poetic Edda, all of these exist within the warrior class. But it's also partly the priestly role to take these words and to instantiate them, to write them down, and to give them a kind of solidity. So that this is part of the role of the priest. And as the culture goes forward, this word crafting or whatever begins to formalize itself into law. And in the West, part of that transformation is that as we rationalized thinking and law and so forth, we began to place a kind of trust in words and diplomacy to sort of solve problems. But the dichotomy is that we separated violence from this sense of code. So you can then put a gun in someone's hand. And so some of the most terrible wars prior to that time came during the period of the Enlightenment in the 1700s, when democracy is emerging, this rule of law is emerging. So you have all of this sort of, and the merchant classes are ascending. But at the same time, you had these horrific wars that swept all across Europe, post-Reformation, through Napoleon, all of these, I think, where you have these masses of soldiers, and the violence, in a sense, becomes disconnected from this kind of, as you say, this warrior ethos. Not entirely, but it's there's a kind of growing mechanical nature to it. And we almost then, as this works itself out, we almost try to deny to ourselves, because of this nation of democracy and diplomacy and so forth, that at the heart of the foundation of society is the exercise of violence, something that would have been completely obvious to a knight in the year 1000, the 1100s, 1200s. But we have a hard time grappling that our society is built and founded upon violence. And we look at it as it's built upon like the vote and the rule of law and the marketplace of ideas. And we see societies formed around these things. But while we talk about rule of law and ever, we also have this whole thing now where we have mechanized violence that then almost has no limits in some sense. The violence this is, I think, the thing that Junger is noting in World War I as well too. So I don't know if that makes sense to you at all. No,
it does. I always think of the famous quote from Starship Troopers, right? When the professor tells them, violence is the supreme authority from which all authority is derived. In an earthly sense, that's true. Any rule that you enforce, at the end of the day, whether consciously or subconsciously, you realize this is enforced by violence, right? If you're given a seatbelt ticket, you pay the ticket because you're supposed to, but at the end of the day, you do have to be aware that there is the ability to enforce that through force, right?
Yeah.
That is sort of, it's a fact of life. It's the same thing with children to an extent, right? Your children know that, like, okay, I have to do what my parents tell me because, I respect them, but also they can make me do it, right?
Yeah, they may get a paddle on the backside.
Yeah, that's probably why we have the spare the rod, right? Because you can't divorce those things completely. It's
No.
impossible. Um, and I think what you see is what you're kind of highlighting is kind of the same thing that I was drawing out, which is that the warrior caste does not disappear from society just overnight. It's a slow degradation through, I look at it more through a technological lens. Like I said,
Yes.
I think the separation of combatants, the distance in between the combatants increases, it increases the brutality.
I think
And
it's
it
an excellent
also,
point, John.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it removes the need for the code, right? And
Yes.
there's a really poignant part in Junger's book, The Glass Bees, where he's his main character, and I forget his name now, but he's trained as a cavalry officer his entire life, and he has this moment where they ride out into the battlefield, and he realizes that they've all been mowed down by, and he says like this pimple faced kid with a machine gun is essentially how he describes them, right?
Yeah.
And he realizes that all their training, his entire life, riding horses, everything, living together, this brotherhood, this camaraderie, everything that they had done in an instant was gone, right? And it was, and he talked about how skill on the battlefield is removed. It becomes about luck, right? That artillery shell doesn't hit you, machine gun fire doesn't hit you. All of these things, sort of, like I said, they create this distance, and they also make the warrior caste obsolete. And with the warrior caste becoming obsolete, they no longer occupy a ruling place within the society. So you no longer have men that are capable of violence and understand what that looks like, making decisions that result in violence, right? So you get a Hillary Clinton deciding to bomb places, right? Whereas, in my personal opinion, you'd be a lot better off having somebody who understands what that is, who understands intimately like what you're doing. Okay, if we do this, this is what's going to happen. I'm willing to take on that burden. These people aren't willing to do that. And I think, like I said, I think the technology is sort of you can just track the technology. There's an old saying that all swordsmen hate archers, right? Because the archer increases that distance. Now the archer still has to have much more training, and he's much closer to the combat, right? But you just take that same idea and you keep expanding upon it, right? And you see this throughout history as it increases. And to my point about watching the warrior caste slowly dissipate, you even see this, around probably the 18th, 17th, 18th century, even probably early, somewhat into the 19th. But look at how the warriors or the officer class would treat each other, especially in European context, right?
Exactly. Yes. Very good point.
The officer class was the remnants of the warrior caste within this mass military. And so they had their specific rules. There's a great scene in the film, the film with Daniel Day-Lewis, where he's an Indian, and I'm blanking on it now. Last of the Mohicans.
Yes.
Where they surrender the fort. And when they surrender the fort, they go through this whole process where they go through the whole ceremony. They're complimenting each other and all this stuff. And the natives are very angry about this because they don't understand. They're like, well, no, we were promised scalps. We were promised all this. And the French officer, of course, he stabs him in the back in the end, but he tells him at first, he's like, this is the way we do things. Yeah. Right. We treat, and even into World War I, the officers were treated especially well when they were captured because they were seen as a part of that caste. And again, Evola makes this point when he talks about, and I don't know that he's 100% right on this, but I think the sentiment is somewhat true, that he says that the Crusader, the Christian knight, and the Muslim warrior, the Saracen, offered each other the ability to go to paradise, right? In his wording, which we can disagree with that, but the idea being that they both offered each other that and were aware of that to some extent. And you see this in the way Saladin, or not necessarily Saladin himself, but the Muslim chroniclers will talk about Richard the Lionheart. If you read their talk, the way they talk about him, they praise him constantly because they see him as this great warrior. They even talk about how his presence alone would shift a battle, right? His presence on the battlefield. That sort of, you see that remnant continue on up until probably really until I think World War I is the line of demarcation for that. And
Yeah,
once you
destroyed
get World War
the
II,
two world wars destroyed. I think Black
Mhm.
Horse has noted this too. That the two world wars really destroyed. That was they destroyed the last remnants of the warrior elite
yeah, I
in
mean, and part
society.
of this is because if you look at the casualty rate for the officer class, specifically the British, right? They were much more likely to get killed, and that took a toll. And I think the brutalizing nature of industrial warfare also made it very difficult to look at war and see anything that remotely looks like chivalry or honor. How do you see honor when you're, if you go to World War II, right? You're firebombing cities. How do you see honor when
Artillery doesn't deal in honor.
right artillery? And that's one of the most terrifying things in all combat. If you've ever been there,
Wow.
it's
Like the Ukraine
much more
conflict
scary.
today. And the Ukraine conflict today boils down to, they say, what is it? 9 out of every 10 conflict like deaths occur because of an artillery shell.
Right.
So it's just a simple math. If your side is producing only 2,000 shells a day and the other side is producing 10,000 shells a day, you can run the numbers on how many casualties you're experiencing versus how many they're experiencing, and you think that's kind of where war has come down to.
Yeah, I mean, just go read the stats on the Somme or any of the World War I battles and look at the amount of shells that were dropped. It's in the millions sometimes in these numbers that would blow your mind.
Ukraine, it dwarfs Ukraine. And this, I think, when raises an interesting point, and people have a hard time grappling with this sometimes, is that medieval warfare, and so you begin with as the emergence of the Western warrior class as a distinct, the warrior knight with the chivalry and so forth in around the year 1000, that the goal wasn't necessarily always to kill your opponent, your combatant. A lot of it was ritualized. A lot of it was, basically getting him to submit, in part because combat carried with it this old Germanic element of, the trial by combat. You see this in Song of Roland, emphasizes that this battle that happens in this valley is really an exercise of trial by combat. And the one gentleman who's a traitor then has to go through, there's a trial by combat there. And again, he loses, so he's dead and was proved to be. But I think people don't understand that the goal wasn't necessarily to kill somebody, but it was to restore and to maintain honor. So if you had a border dispute between two Christian princes or two Christian lords or dukes, or whatever, those border disputes were, I guess in part economic, but a lot of times they were about honor and dishonor. So it's about, you're not respecting my borders. And so in a violent world, you forced me to do something about it. And then all of the Retuan, of course, these are men intimately connected with violence. They would understand what it means. So yeah, accidents happen, people do die. It's, it's part of the thing, but really the goal wasn't necessarily to go out and kill all of the people who, the neighboring lord. The goal was basically just simply to restore order and to establish what was right again, which is our border being in the right place and the dishonor of him stealing our border. Right. So there's a whole nature of the honor culture, and all these rules are built up around it, and killing people wasn't necessarily the goal. Whereas today, oftentimes it's a very different mentality in terms of combat, where yeah, you want your opponent to submit, but oftentimes it's just done to the brutal reality of, we're just going to keep killing you until you basically yield and can no longer defend yourselves.
Yeah, it becomes a war of attrition. Every war is essentially a war of attrition to some degree, right? We can all squabble over something like, well, I'll say the last couple of years we've seen a lot of discussion around the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And I grew up as an American, right? Obviously, I grew up thinking like, well, this was a necessary thing we had to do, blah, blah, blah. It was good because of this. But if you step out from especially if you're an American, you can step away from your emotional attachment to it, and you realize that you're dropping a nuclear weapon on a civilian population, women, children, whatever. This is something that would have. These things occurred. There were massacres. You look at sieges. These things did occur, but I don't think the idea of that level of brutality towards the civilian population so far removed from the battlefield for a non-strategic position would have ever occurred. I don't think you would have seen the Knights on Crusade go, they might siege Acre, right, or one of these cities. They wouldn't have gone 1,000 miles out of their way to just go burn down a Muslim town and kill everybody just to come back, right? But the reason I bring that up, though, is because, again, that's sort of the extreme example of this complete lack of code and this complete lack of a rule set existing whatsoever. And I think that's because that died with that warrior caste, right? And it's because, and people will point and they'll say, well, you have these people like MacArthur and these guys, these great generals that advocated for these sort of policies. But as controversial as this is, I would not say that they were warriors. They're professional soldiers, right? And in a medieval context, right, going back to your point about you're fighting over, a border dispute, and if you win, you get this territory. If you don't, you don't get the territory. And part of that is, for one, I mean, you didn't have mass militaries the way you do now. You couldn't just conscript thousands and thousands of people, because if we remember, the way medieval society is structured, these knights aren't necessarily loyal to the king, right? They're loyal to the aristocracy, the landed gentry, so to speak. That's who they're loyal to, and that guy has to go and raise an army for the king. The king can't just make everybody. And if he tries to, and if he's gonna try that, he better make sure the war he's fighting is worth something. It can't just be some arbitrary conflict.
Oh, he has to reward those warriors for the and that was also one of the problems, as as you go from, and this is the thing that happens from the transition from like the 600s-700s, with Charlemagne and others, as you move up forward into the High Middle Ages, and the beginning of what we would call Western culture, is those early wars of conquest. You could go out from your territory and you could conquer people that were not your own and bring back booty. But what do you do now then, where everyone is a Christian nation or a Christian people, land, and the whole continent is now, the Holy Roman Empire? You can no longer go out to other Christian nations and, collect booty and stuff. So you have to be very, very careful with your Lord, because it's all, again, still honor and reward. So I give you loyalty, and in return, I gain position, status, and reward. And that dynamic, very personal, has to be maintained. So if you go out to war, your guys have to see that there's a direct benefit for us to be out fighting. Otherwise, that bond gets, you break fundamentally that bond of loyalty between the Lord and the vassal, which is fundamental to, because we think of feudalism as a quote unquote system, but it wasn't a system. It was basically a collection of loyalty of loyalty relations spread over a whole continent. Most of these men couldn't read or write, and yet they understood all of these loyalty relationships.
Yeah, it's also interesting because a lot of people, they'll look at the type of combat that occurs in medieval warfare, and it's brutal. Obviously, it's hand to hand. But I think what's interesting is that if you look at medieval warfare, it's almost, in almost all cases, it's professional soldiers and the warrior caste fighting each other. That's all it is. It's not civilians. You're not conscripted. Towns are most of the time avoided, right? Because you don't want to destroy or burn down these places that may become your territory, and you don't want to destroy the population that lives there either, right? And to your point about now everybody's Christian, right? If you go back to even the Greeks, right? The Greeks have different rules for fighting Greeks than they do for fighting barbarians. This idea of having a rule set for your people, specifically of how you treat each other, goes back forever. I mean, like I said, the Greeks did this. This is I forget the term for it now, but the Greeks didn't, this is even a point that, Schmidt makes in Concepts of the Political, when he draws on comparing, inimicus and hostis, right?
Yes.
These words are different because you don't treat the personal enemy the same way you do the outside threat to your society. Right? So even in the Crusades, the rules of engagement in the Crusades are much different than had it been, one of the French kingdoms fighting some German kingdom or vice versa.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at the world from that Germanic side, the Germanic that as Germanic and Christian culture wove themselves together, that sort of the Roman, the Christian, and the Germanic wove itself together in Europe, that element of trial by combat remained very, very strong, right? Even so, if we go out and, this is, you see this very present in Song of Roland, but it's very present in, in the Crusades. In a sense, we are bringing God's judgment on the Saracen. And the Saracen, because he was, at least in the first crusade, they were defeated. This was a sign that our cause was righteous. And if for us, we don't think that way today, because we think of an abstract law that judges everybody equally and so forth. But in that particular context, if you defeat the Saracen on battle, that means God was on your side and his cause was unjust and yours was just. And that was just the way it worked.
I mean, you even see this with some descriptions of the Mongols, right? They see the Mongols as the hand of God, as divine punishment, right? Or other groups. It doesn't have to be the Mongols, but you see this idea of like, okay, this is the divine punishment. We're doing something wrong. And even though Genghis Khan is not a Christian, he is still an instrument of God. God still uses him or can use him, right? Because, and this is probably a separate conversation, but this goes to the idea that it may be impossible to some degree for us to believe the way a medieval peasant would have believed, right?
No.
Like,
and I've often thought that as well too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
well, and
that
you see. Go ahead.
I was just saying it was just an a priori. It was just there.
Yeah,
there was no question about it. They didn't question it. So when things happened, the assumption was this is the will of God in some way. I mean, you even see Das Vault, right? God wills it, right? If we're going to go out into battle and we lose, that's God's will. Like you said it, and I think you can even make a comparison to look at how corrupted the later Crusades become. The motivations for the later Crusades become less and less about taking back the Holy Land for religious reasons or protecting Christians on pilgrimage, and they become about acquiring land and.
But that's also about the time. But that's also about the time, is because we're thinking the Crusades happen over what, a 400-year period, right? Mm-hmm. So you're right at the cusp of the Reformation. You're right at the cusp of the emergence of the merchant classes during that time. So there's a shift occurring in culture. The warrior elite are already losing their hold on society at that. You can see the beginnings of it there in the later Crusades, that there are other dynamics other than honor that are at play in that. You still see it like holding up, like Calvin's Institutes. Calvin even talks about the hand of God's hand of judgment on, because generally the position is sacrosanct. The fact that you would overthrow your ruler is just inconceivable, because that's God put them there. But Calvin would acknowledge that sometimes God uses evil men to bring judgment upon the king. Right. And very explicit in that. And so, I mean, it's not the kind of thing you necessarily want to claim for yourself, that I'm God's hand of judgment. But there's this sense that God does raise up people that, in necessary, that will defeat you and bring you down because you're being judged that way. And the sign that you're being judged is that you're being cast down from your throne. And so some of these dynamics, in a sense, we lost a battle. It must be, and you can see this in the biblical record, where we lost the battle, we have to go back and seek the Lord to find out why we lost, because there must be something that is spiritually wrong with us. What is it? You see this in the battle of the conquest of Canaan, right? You go out and you lose a battle, the battle over Ai, and then it's discovered that there was idols in a tent that they were holding on to. And so the whole family had to be put to death. And then once that was taken care of and they were right with God again, then they could go out in battle and they could begin to reconquer the land. So these elements have remained very, very strong. But that, I think, maybe leads us to some of the couple questions. Is this transition into the merchant classes? And you and I were talking ahead of time, and I think we can see the merchant classes as they rise up alongside of the warrior and the priest, and they begin to challenge the warrior class and the structure of the warrior class. And there, it's no longer about honor. It's just simply about making money and ideas. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the questions, and you and I were talking about this before we began recording, is the unique question of America, because America, of course, emerges out of the European context that began already around the year 1000. And that America really begins as a colonized people, as a merchant venture in many ways. Mm-hmm. And very much the beginning, once, there was of course, violence that established it through the American Revolution. But even then, there was this reasoned discussion. They came together to talk about, the Constitution and all of these other documents, Bill of Rights and others. So there was this sort of talking together and coming together. And so ideas and so forth form a very heart of it. And there was many who were very, very suspicious at the beginning of the founding of America of the notion of a standing army. Yeah. And so you have this notion of, democratized, that we establish power through the rule of law and through talking. And there is almost this sense. So here's the question then, is if culture is born and carried through and begins with the warrior class, one can, I think, draw the connection. If there has never really been a warrior caste in America, in a sense, does America even have a culture? And now the question comes in maybe with the South, perhaps, and some of these things, but there is this question of, does America even have a culture, or is it just simply that we're a commercial people without a culture and our only concern is basically money and law?
I think, so I tend to have this more esoteric view that the warrior caste exists throughout time and history, regardless. Right now, okay, whether it has the ability to manifest or not is different. Because there are people that I believe, like if I were to look at the Navy SEALs today, I think a lot of those people would be part of the warrior caste if the warrior caste existed, and that impulse that lies within them leads them to do the things that they do. Right. But that being said, so I think it always exists in some remnant, and it finds ways, it finds ways to show itself where the opportunity lies. And that being said, in America, I think the warrior caste in America, insofar as it existed, was pretty much in the South, as you said. And there's this, the imagery of the surrender at Appomattox, right? And if you've ever read about this, it's very clear for a lot of people that they see the North as this industrialized, mechanized force backed by finance, right? And the South, because even if you can have your views on slavery however you want, but it's an aristocratic, it's much closer to the way Europe is structured, right? And because of that, there's a martial tradition where you send your sons to go to these military academies, they're trained. And so at the surrender of Appomattox courthouse, Grant doesn't come in dressed in his perfect uniform. He doesn't do all that. But when Lee meets him, Lee comes in dressed in his perfect uniform. He brings his sword to surrender. Lee wants to go through the entire ceremony because Lee is, for all intents and purposes, Lee is the representative of the ideal warrior in America, in the American sense, right? So, like I said, insofar as it existed, it kind of dies at that moment, right? And and as you said, since it's sort of the birth of culture emerges from this. The one place in America that has had its distinct culture up until recently, it's starting to kind of die out, is the South. The South had its distinct culture, and so I think that's true. I guess I kind of go back and forth on it because part of me wants to say that there hasn't been, but then I think that it started to in the South. It started to emerge, and then it was killed. Essentially, it was kind of strangled in its crib.
I would concur with that in a sense, because you look at, again, if we take Spengler's basic theory, that it takes 20 generations. So you come here in the 1600s, and by the time you're in the middle of the 1800s, you're half to 2/3 through that process. And in the South, as you say, this is the one thing that really got impressed upon me in the book, The Land They Fought For by Clifford Doughty, is this idea that the South had a unique time feeling. That was kind of a very Spenglerian kind of way of thinking about it. And the North was on the clock. Everything was about productivity. The industry. It's almost like the World War I, a presage of what was coming in World War I, sort of the industrialized warfare before it was really industrialized warfare.
Right.
And the South had this sort of different time feeling, this aristocratic culture, and the emergence of a war. Like, so you think if the Civil War hadn't happened, and there were those that made the argument that slavery itself was probably going to pass away within a few generations anyways. If they had just been left alone, that the South would have emerged with a distinct new culture of its own. By today, if the Civil War hadn't happened, the South probably, very possibly, could have had a very unique culture, very, very separate and different from the Northern United States. Now, it was, in a sense, it was killed stillborn during the Civil War. I mean, I think remnants still exist here and there in pockets. There's an undercurrent, Spengler's turn. It lives under a false face, you might say. But I think there's something to that with Lee and with the warrior elite. It was like a warrior elite that almost was born, but never quite came to being fully born. And
you still see, to your point about time, right? That's something that even up until probably, I mean, it probably still exists to some degree now, but even as a young man, I experienced that when I left, because my family's been in the South. My family's been in America since before the Revolution on both sides, and they lived in the South the entire time. And leaving and moving out, and I lived in California for a while and a few other places. The joke was always that Southerners are slow. Everything's slowed down, right? And I never really understood that till I moved out. And then I never really truly understood it till I went to the islands and I experienced island time, right? And island time is essentially just, we do things when we want, right? The store opens at 10 o'clock, maybe, right? Like, we would rent stuff and, okay, well, we're going to be there at 10. The guy shows up at 10:45 because he didn't feel like showing up yet, The South was very much that way in a lot of ways. And in fact, right now I'm reading, The Light in August by Faulkner. And you can even see it in that, right? You see the time, like no one's rushing to do things. People don't spend all their time working and they're not chasing the clock. So that still existed. And I think there's something to that, but I think, it's often hard for people to look at it that way because the shadow of slavery, right?
Yes.
Colors
it had to be done.
Yeah,
we had to completely destroy this culture because of slavery.
Yeah. But what they also fail to realize is, maybe it's structured wrong and there are a lot of things wrong with it, but it is that aristocratic society that allows for that to exist in the first place, right? You have this structured society, you have this hierarchy, people going back to the Spartans, people forget the Spartans weren't working the fields. They had other Greeks working the fields.
Neither were the Romans in many ways.
Right. They're a different class, they held themselves, but again, with the South, from that same culture, you had this idea, this paternalistic culture, this idea of taking care of each other, this idea of, because you've been gifted this position, you have an obligation, noblesse oblige, right? And all that kind of, I think, stems within that warrior caste, right? But like you said, it's defeated by, it's essentially a quantity versus quality. It's a material.
And the machine just mows it down.
Yeah, and there's no place for it. And the warrior can't exist in warfare now today anyways, in a modern context, because how can he? Because what happens if you say, well, we have these rules that we're not going to break in combat regardless? You can't win,
No. Well, and you look at like even the things when you think of technologized, rules of engagement, or perhaps the remnant of that old warrior code, right? But you think of yourself, how often has American arms, missions and things that they've done throughout the world, how many times have they been hampered because the rules of engagement won't allow them to actually fight the way that they really should be fight to get this conflict over and done with quickly and as cleanly as possible. And so they drag out and so forth because the rules of engagement are terrible.
Well, I was going to say, that's the same reasoning that like Sherman gives for doing what he does when he marches through the South and just burning and destroying, raping and pillaging. is his idea. Oh, well, the more brutal it is, the quicker it'll end, right? And you contrast that with the way Lee forces his soldiers to behave when they invade the North, right?
Yes.
When he makes his campaign to the North, he's very explicit. And it's not that stuff probably didn't happen, but the way he holds his troops to a standard that they're not going to do these things. They're not going to go in and rob people's houses and burn their houses down. We don't do that. Right.
And that's emerging. That's not like technocratic control like you have today in today's military, where it's imposed from above. That's emerging from organically from within the culture of the people that's there. Like, this is something that Lee feels very deeply. No one told him that this is how you have to treat people. This is just how we do things. Everybody knows. This is the things that everybody knows. And I'm just here as your leader to remind you of what everybody knows.
Right. And it only works if those people know that.
Yeah, that's right. And
yeah.
Some guys might grumble, but all deep down, they know the things that Lee knows. But, war is a brutal business. And sometimes when you're in a brutal business, it can circumvent your morality. And so, Lee then is in that position to remind people of the things that they already know and hold them to it. And that's what in that sense, what a leader does. I guess we're getting close to an hour here, but one of the questions that I have, and maybe one of the remaining questions, is because you've gotten yourself into this sort of warrior versus soldier debate. And it's in part because of some of these guys, like the SEAL operators and so forth, these special forces types, who struggle with the notion of the soldier because they see it, I think, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but they see it somehow as lesser than the idea of the warrior. And so why is it important for guys today to want to be warriors when in fact they're soldiers?
Well, first, I think a lot of veterans take it personally, right? Because the connotation of the warrior, even if we remove its true meaning historically, even in today's context, it has a higher value than the soldier. The soldier sort of is just, he carries this image of just being basically a little better than a mercenary, right? And especially with the SEAL operators, any of the special forces operators, in a physical sense, in the martial sense, they are very close. They're closer to warriors, right? They're highly trained, highly skilled, very disciplined, right? They're missing everything else. So they I think they want this distinction because they're not soldiers. They're not just your average infantrymen. And they are at a higher standard, but that label is also something, and I've had this conversation with people before, that label gets twisted in the post 9/11, right? It's sort of it's a propaganda tool, right? We're warriors, because it creates this imagery, and it pulls at this feeling in people, especially in young men, that they want to be that. Because most of us at some point in our lives fantasized when we were kids, about being whoever it was, Achilles, whoever, Hercules, Lee, whatever your cultural hero was or warrior. And I think that was twisted and used as a tool of propaganda during those wars. And we were told that 24/7, and they want to believe that. They really do want to believe that. And I get that impulse, but I think it's important for young men and guys in the military now, or people looking to go in, to understand the difference, because the warrior is more than just his ability to basically kill another person, right? He is just as disciplined in every other aspect of his life, right? He's not a drunk, right? And you see, like, a lot of soldiers, they drink, they party, they do all these things. The warrior doesn't do that. The warrior holds himself to a higher standard across the board in every aspect of his life. And there's also a spiritual component. And I think this is also important because one of the things I've been trying to fight against for so long is this feminized Christianity. And I think one of the ways you get out of that is to have masculine men come into Christianity. But the only way you do that is to show them what masculine Christianity is. And the ideal for that is that warrior, right? The image of the warrior. The one of the best essays you'll ever read on this is C.S. Lewis's essay on chivalry. It's a phenomenal essay where he goes into explaining, like, it doesn't even matter if they were they actually stuck to these rules. The fact that these rules were the ideal is what's important.
Yes, and the fact that for us as Protestants so much that we have farmed out the political to the state and just basically focused on the church is solely and completely about the priestly role. That we have lost all connection with a healthy and properly ordered understanding of the place of the king, first of all, but not the king in a sense as like the president as a technologized, the sort of modern democratized thing, but the king as the embodiment of force and violence in our society. So constrained within, it's the position, it's the manifestation in some sense of God's judgment in society. And so the king, in a sense, is supposed to embody the rule of law, to embody God's judgment, to embody righteousness in society. And this is why the king bears so much criticism from the prophets in the old, because if you as a king allow injustice in your society, you have basically, you're sort of teaching people to abandon God in that regard. And so there is, but because we have sort of farmed this out to our liberal democratic state, and we've just said, well, the church is just merely the priestly mode or the prophetic mode, we no longer have the capacity to properly understand this function that we live in a sinful world. Violence is a fact of life. It needs to be constrained by our faith. But because it's a sinful world, there is a function for it, both in the enforcement of justice and also the protection of your people. And those two roles primarily, in many ways, Western Christianity, we've lost those roles. And because we've lost those roles, we're now just seen as a bunch of priests. And as a result, we get treated like priests because the priests are sort of that. Yeah, it's just everything that goes along. They're men of prayer. They're not men of violence who are constrained by their faith.
It's interesting because I think you shared this a while back. I did a Twitter thread where I went through all the Medal of Honor recipients that were chaplains in the military.
Yes.
All of them post, I think, World War I or post the Civil War, maybe. They were all Catholic priests, right? And that's not to be disparaging towards any Protestants at all, but I think there's something to examine in that now post Vatican II things are different, right? But prior to that, there was still a very masculine impulse within the priesthood within the Catholic Church. And these men were willing to go, and I think there's probably something there about having, the idea of giving last rites and transubstantiation with, the Eucharist, like having to do that. But these men would go on the battlefield and they would risk everything to give last rites to soldiers, right? And then that's what most cases of them. And in fact, the very first chaplain killed, the Confederate chaplain killed, was a Catholic priest. He was giving last rites and he had a cannonball take his head off, right? But these were men that clearly felt the need to be on the battlefield, but were also very spiritual and felt a calling to the priesthood, right?
Yes.
And I think they can be looked as examples, regardless of whether you're Catholic or Protestant, and go, okay, you can be both. For one, you can be both. You can be masculine and you can be a priest. And a priest has a place on the battlefield, even if it is just to give last rites and to administer, to do mass or whatever, But also, there's a place for masculinity, period, and violence within the church in a constrained Christian sense. There's a reason we have just war theory. There's a reason we have these things, and they have to exist. And it's sort of one of my issues that I focus on the most, because one of the reasons that I left Christianity when I was young was because there wasn't a place for me, right? There was no place. Like every guy that was active was questionable, right? Like, there's a lot of guys that I was like, I think you're hiding here, if that makes sense. And I didn't see a place for me at all. And so I think it's really important to show what a warrior really is and really emphasize the spiritual discipline. You even look at the way in which you're supposed to, if you carry your rosary on you, and I don't know if you know this, you're supposed to carry it on your left side, right? And the symbology behind that is that the knight would carry his sword on his left side. It's his weapon. So when he would draw it out, right? There's that element exists, and it needs to come back, because young men aren't going to come to the church. They're not going to come to faith if they feel like it's completely feminized. And if we don't give them examples of what the alternative is, and real examples, there's no hope. Like, why would they, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting. I've always used, or for a long time used, meditative prayer. And that's partly because of the influences I've had from as we were discussing in the group chat today, from Peyton and others. And I've embraced sort of meditative prayer for myself, but I never really thought about it. But I always carry it in my left pocket, and I don't put it in my right pocket. It just automatically goes in my left pocket. I never really thought about it beforehand. And this may be a different thought. And I wonder if the struggle and the difference that you're trying to capture is a difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. Is in Catholicism, you still have hierarchy, however corrupted or however it's been influenced by, managerial trends or whatever. There is still this sense of hierarchy in the Catholic Church. And so it still does harken back to these old understandings of, the order of being and so forth. And I think there's, in that regard, more place for old hierarchical understandings, including the role of, the noble warrior in that regard. Whereas Protestantism, for all of the things, at a time when the church had become very corrupt, the ways in which the Reformation did reform the Christian faith through that. But one of the transformations that's happening in the Reformation is that what's going on in the Reformation is that it's also adapting the Christian faith to the merchant classes and to the sympathies and dynamics of the merchant classes. And so that becomes that kind of Spenglerian, sort of what Spengler talks about in the way that the merchant classes, take power away from the warrior elite and basically overthrow them through law, through commerce, through rationality, through discussion. And I wonder if part of the problem that Protestants have, and where you're talking about the holdover, like in England, where you have a remaining, warrior elite up until World War I. Well, in England, you still had the Anglican Church, which still had a strong sense of hierarchy. And I wonder if in North American context, there's never been that true same type of thing, because it's always been somewhat, at least from the north, like you might say from the North perspective anyways, it's always been somewhat a merchant thing. And Protestantism is the Christian faith of the merchant classes. And so it's the Christian faith in the merchant classes really in and of itself isn't built around, and is in some ways resistance to the honor dynamics that are essential to the merchants. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just something that kind of occurred to me as we were talking.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people associate the South with evangelical Protestantism, and that really is something that emerges later, more towards the end of the Civil War, right?
Almost after in Reconstruction.
Exactly. Yeah. And prior to that, most of them are Anglican, right? There are Presbyterian, or they're higher church Methodist, right? Where you have that very strict hierarchy. And I grew up in an evangelical church as a kid, and I don't want this to sound disparaging, and I'm not meaning to be critical, but one of the things that I've found that appeals to young men is, to your point about hierarchy, it's the hierarchy, but it's also the hierarchy within whether it's Mass or they're going to an Orthodox, I forget what the Orthodox call it, not Mass, but whether they're going to church, an Orthodox church, because of the structure, right? And it doesn't have to be a traditional Latin Mass. It can just be a very, very respectful Novus Order Mass as well. And I've talked to a lot of young men about this, you feel like you're worshiping the creator of the universe more so than this intimate relationship This because a lot of, especially as you get lower down, there's a lot of emotionalism, right? It's about this personal relationship as opposed to it's easier to sell a young man that you're kneeling before the creator of the universe or the king than it is what I call boyfriend Jesus, right? This very emotional, this very personal thing. Young men it's masculine young men are going to turn away from that. There just are. Well, and that's not to say that, and I know there's Protestant churches that have very reverent, ceremonies or whatever, but I think that's a big factor in it is giving not just the hierarchy of the church itself, which is important, but the hierarchy of essentially like look at the way mass works, where everything is regimented and meaningful, and everything is done with a specific set of rules that represent something ancient, right?
I really like this in a sense, John, because it does in that sense make sense, because some of the stuff I've been writing on with Walter on about the difference between men and women, and how they use language and so forth. So men talk to establish hierarchy, right? To create space, and it's so I establish my position and I create hierarchy, right? So I establish where we are in the intellectual, that's kind of, whereas women use language to bond, right? So if you have a feminine worship environment, like church worship environment, so what would then be the point of worship? It would be, as you say, bonding, right? So it's one thing. Whereas for guys, they're looking to come into church to establish territory and create hierarchy. And part of it having that hierarchy is, in a sense, have a code, right? And so the structure of the liturgy, in a sense, molds the man into a code that he can then helps shape the rest of his life. I really like that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that carries over, like you said, shaping the rest of his life, everything from, like using the rosaries, it's meditative, but it's structured. You know what you're doing. You know when it's happening, how to do it properly. This is how you do it, or you're following the liturgy of the hours. Same thing. Like, okay, this is what I'm doing. And also, again, to pull back to the warrior thing, these are all things that are very spiritual, but also you would have to be very disciplined and tough to even come close to the level of like commitment, we'll say, that a knight would have had.
Yes.
In his prayer life, or in his commitment to going to mass daily or at least once a week or whatever. Or like I said, like the Knights Templar, you see this with them actively foregoing, comforts, all comforts, putting themselves in these positions so that not only did they train their bodies to be capable of extreme violence and very good at that, but also they did the same thing in their spiritual lives, right?
Yeah, and I could see, because I'm not of the mind that we have to sort of erase all of the differences and kind of go, some sort of mass ecumenicism, because I think there's good reasons why differences in our churches exist, and I think in some ways they're even important. But I do think that there is something that, without men having to necessarily be warriors per se, but there is something about men being men where that higher expectation of structure, discipline, where you're expected to come out to morning prayer and afternoon prayer before and after work every day. And there's a certain structure to the worship in the liturgy that can be distinctly Protestant, but yet can then provide men with that sense of code and hierarchy that they need to, in a sense, be men. And they don't necessarily have to be warriors, but it can then be the thing that can carry over for them as an employee, as a husband, as, a friend, and all of these other things, to provide that kind of structure for them that can be rooted. And then, in a sense, it's not even the worst thing in the world to learn from other traditions of, like, what are the kind of things that you guys do that are rooted in history that we could then maybe borrow from you and make our own.
Yeah, no, I think, to use an example of, you could look at Cromwell, right? And look at those guys. They're extremely disciplined, right? They don't have the same, they're not high church. They don't have the same liturgy, right? But to say that they weren't equally committed and there's an extreme masculinity to them would be a lie,
Yes.
in my opinion.
Exactly.
So there are plenty of Protestant examples. I think the issue at least in America, and I'm assuming it's similar in Canada,
Yes,
is the how common the evangelical sort of non-denominational stuff is. And that's not to say, I have friends that are part of those churches, but I think it's very difficult. You're fighting a losing battle with young men in that environment in most cases.
Because
at least in my opinion.
Men don't want Jesus as their boyfriend.
No. And I think, and one other aspect of this that I think is crucial, and it doesn't have to be structured this way specifically, I don't think, but the act of like something like confession, right? So one of the big things that changed dramatically the environment that I was in was we got a younger priest. He's like in his 50s. And the first thing he did was he put up altar rails or communion rails. And he also would very adamantly set confession times. And he would say, he still does this before the Eucharist, right? He always says, if you haven't been to confession in a month, you don't need to come up here.
Yeah.
He doesn't turn you away, but he just reminds you like, hey, this is important. All those things I think for men are especially important, right? And even if it's done in a more communal setting, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be, structured the way that the Catholic Church or Orthodox or whoever does it. But all those structures give men a place. And it's just like you said, with hierarchy, it's the way the military works, right?
And
or the
that.
way they do, or the way to, how do you become a knight? You're a squire first. You go through all the things the squire does. And then before you become a knight, there's an entire ceremony. You bathe the night before, you wear special clothes. And then people forget about this. The original knighting ceremony occurs at the end of Mass. They do Mass
after a night of prayer and meditation and fasting.
Then you go to Mass, everybody does Mass, and then you come up and you get knighted. It's all connected in there, right? So I think all those things kind of roll together. And I think that's why the warrior thing is important. And the distinction is so important, because a warrior is not just running around and being the toughest guy on the battlefield. It's applying that same discipline that allows you to become a martial force, but applying that in every aspect of your life, but especially in the spiritual aspect, and holding yourself to a standard that nobody else but God is really holding you to.
Well, and I think this maybe helps answer that question of why is it so important for guys today to think of themselves as warriors, is because a lot of us as men sense that missing component, that it's like, I'm really good at this fighting thing, and like I'm world class. I'm a SEAL, but yet even the SEAL feels like there's something missing, and he doesn't maybe necessarily know what it is.
Well,
but it's that spiritual component.
Well, you even see this with a lot of guys I've known, especially in the special forces community. Will be, some of them are religious, some of them are very devout and whatever. A lot of them are Catholic or Orthodox, but a lot of them, they don't pick a specific religion, but they develop these really intense spiritual habits, meditative habits. They're seeking that thing, right? To use your show, they're seeking the hidden thing. They're looking for that, and there's no direction for it. And when they go to look towards the church they probably grew up in, they look at that and they go, I don't want any part of that.
Yeah, Jesus isn't my boyfriend.
Yeah, that doesn't sound cool. But hey, like samurais are cool, so I'm going to look into Buddhist, forgetting that we have our very own version of that, which is the knight.
That's exactly it.
So I think that's why it's important.
Yeah, and because it has been, the merchant class is so systematically squashed that in society because they had to. That was just part of their cultural development. It's just there's nowhere to go to find it, and that's the unfortunate thing. There aren't really living examples in the ways that you really need there to be. Like, we can talk about it, we can intellectualize it, we can pick fragments out, we can understand what's happening, but it really isn't. And this is, I think, one of the things that our discourses are really good about, is that in order to reinstantiate some of these things, we have to start talking about them first and understand what it is that we're missing.
No, I agree 100%. And I think if men are looking for the best examples they can, they have to look historically.
Yes.
Unfortunately, and we can only do so much with that because it's words on a page, and the
you're not
real
living
life,
it.
You're not
There's
living
so
it.
much. There's so much that remains hidden in that
Mhm.
regard from you, because the words only capture so much.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that's why these discussions are important, because hopefully young men will hear this, and then it'll spark a desire to go seek these things out, or it'll allow for people, in your position or in other churches, to hear this and realize, like, oh, well, maybe that's the avenue to reach these younger guys. Right?
Yeah, as a young pastor, maybe there's something I can do here. Like I can,
Mm-hmm.
we can maybe do something. Like we should talk about this, and we can maybe do something in our church here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's been getting on time here, John, and I don't want to keep you. You're a busy man, and I know I saw you hold up the sheet of paper to give a note to somebody. So, anyways, thank you for thank you for coming on. Anyways, just as a play thing, where can people find your work if they want to read some of the stuff that you've written? Because you have written more on this, you've talked about more on this. Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at J Slaughter Esquire. But my Substack is Texas John Slaughter at Substack.com. That's where a lot of my where I do most of my work, my essays. I have an essay specifically on this and I'll tell you the name of it if I can remember. I titled it "The Twilight of the Warriors," and it's a longer essay where I kind of dive more into what the warrior was and how he sort of slowly dissipated from society over basically up until World War I. There's a lot of Junger in there. It's worth a read if you're interested in that. And there's a lot of supplemental stuff.
Sure. Why don't you send me the link, and then I will put it in the show notes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, that's because it's going to take me a few hours. Again, as we were talking beforehand, the processing of all this video is going to crush my computer anyway. So there's a little bit of time for you to, if you can send me that link, I'll throw that in the show notes, and then the listeners can have access to that and read it if they choose. Again, thank you ever so much for coming on.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for having me. And anytime.
Yeah.